COP 16 about biodiversity. Today is Monday, February 10th, 2025. The EcoAction Committee is a standing committee with the Green Party of the United States and will focus on helping organize Greens for local and national events and drive to protect and promote ecological wisdom and sustainability. What is Biodiversity COP? What can we expect to come out of it? And how are activists influencing decision makers around the world to protect the web of life that's keeping us all alive? We have a planned speaker, Mr. Alain Tellier. We're not sure if he understands. Oh, is he here? I'm so glad.
Yep.
Let me see if I can find his name in the.
I just.
Okay, there he is. Okay, so I will introduce Alain since he is here. Alain is a retired career diplomat from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Canada, the Global Affairs Canada, with over 30 years of experience representing Canada on the international scene. Over that period, Mr. Tellier held postings at the Canadian Mission to the United Nations in New York, at the Canadian Mission to the United Nations in Geneva, a bilateral posting at the Consulate General of Canada to Hong Kong and Macau, and a posting to the Joint Delegation of Canada to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, otherwise known as NATO, in Brussels. He held the positions of Director for Treaty Law, Executive Director for Law of the Sea and Environmental Law, Deputy Director of the Crime and Terrorism Division, and Deputy Director of the International Criminal Security and Diplomatic Law Division. So this is a very long and storied career that Mr. Alain has had. And before you begin, will you answer a question for me, Mr. Alain? How many languages do you speak?
I wish I could say 11, only two. I'm
Okay.
French Canadian, as you will soon hear, and of course, much of my work was in English, so I
Okay.
identify with English as well.
All right. Are you ready to start?
Yes, I'm sorry I was late. I have to say I never got an invitation, and I was never told it would be this evening. So this is all first news to me.
Well, we apologize. Sometimes, we just have, it's just a small, very small group of us that organize these. So we apparently dropped a ball. But
Okay.
I'm so glad you were able to make it.
That's, happily, I have a few notes, so let's move on and let's put that behind us.
Okay.
Happy to be there. Happy to see some of you. And I see that I haven't changed. So to say a few words then about this COPs, yes, sorry. Okay. I'm going to speak briefly about COP 16, the resumed session of COP 16. Before I do that, I will provide you a bit of background information, hoping it is not stuff that will bore you because you already are fully aware of all of that. But the stuff that is useful to get this background information. And of course, after that, if you have questions, if you want to discuss any of it, it'd be more than a pleasure for me to do that. So the meeting that is about to take place in Rome is a resumed COP. The Cali meeting was the COP 16. Why a resumed session? It is because they were not able to complete their work. They went overtime, and at one point they reached the point where people had to take their plane and to leave. They lost quorum, and somebody decided to call for a quorum. They could have decided to finish business, to conclude business rapidly, there were a couple of points that some delegations felt had to be addressed. So they decided rather than to close an unsatisfactory COP to have a few of the points for discussion to be move on for another time. That will be at the end of this month in Rome. So before I move further on the Rome meeting, let me take two, three steps back. I won't take too much time. So, and if you find that too boring, wave at me and I'll stop. Uh, this is the Convention on Biodiversity. This is a multilateral treaty. A treaty is a legally binding document under international law. This one has 196 parties, so almost all of the world is party to this convention. We all know one exception to that. The US is not a party, is a signatory, but not a party to the convention. Um, the convention is laying out the main figures, the main avenues for the fight against biodiversity loss. I'm saying the main avenues, and that it provides, the overall objectives that is pursued under the convention. So conservation, sustainable use, and international cooperation in a nutshell. And then it provides general obligations, general commitments to be followed by the parties to the convention. I say general because often, if you look at the text of the convention, often it says parties shall, as far as possible and as appropriate. And in international law language, as far as possible and as appropriate essentially means if you feel like it, you should give it a try. So these are legally binding obligations, yes, but obligations to try to do something to the extent that you find it appropriate. So the convention in that sense is not providing very strong obligations and very strong directions, but it sets the table. It provides general principles. It provides a conference of the parties to meet every 2 years to elaborate on those. It provides for subsidiary bodies and for mechanisms and for overall directions to be followed in the fight against biodiversity loss. But it has to be built upon. And that's what the COPs are for, to build upon the content of the convention. So in moving a couple of years back, in 2022 at COP 15, so the 15th meeting of the Conference of the Parties. A COP is a meeting of all parties going to a conference. So COP 15 in Kunming and then in Montreal, because of COVID, the Kunming meeting had to be reduced and shortened, and then it was finalized in Montreal, where the seat of the Secretariat is. So there happened a very useful development, the adoption of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, the framework, I'll call it. And that is a document which much more specific commitments and much more specific goals and targets, including, you probably have heard, the 30 by 30. So aim to protect 30% of the territory, earth and marine, by the year 2030. And there's a whole list of targets like that are included in the framework as a very useful implementation or continuation of what you find in the treaty. One observation, I'm a lawyer by training, so I like this legally binding stuff and not legally binding stuff. The framework is not a legally binding document. It is not a treaty. It is a political document, a declaration. So it contains much more specific obligations, well, not commitments, but they're not legally binding. Does that make a difference? Well, we could discuss that. Maybe it doesn't make such a difference at the end of the day in terms of the actual effect of the document. But if we had a longer discussion, I could tell you when and how it could make a difference. Anyway, it's to keep in the back of our mind. So COP 15, 2022, the framework was adopted. Then come COP16 in 2024 in Cali, and that is the meeting that was almost completed but not completed late last year. What have they accomplished there? They took stock of how progress was made in implementing the framework adopted 2 years earlier, and they looked at how much progress specific parties made at the national level to implement those international commitments. Then another thing they did in Cali is to establish the Cali Fund, a new international fund to finance efforts related to biodiversity. And I'll tell you a little more about that in a minute. They adopted a very useful decision in relation to the involvement of indigenous people and local communities in the work of the convention. They did a number of other things. They had a total of 29 decisions that were adopted on biodiversity and climate change, biodiversity and health, significant marine areas, invasive alien species, and they also adopted decision on budget, administrative matters, and all of that. But the main elements that were noticed from that meeting is again taking stock. How well are we doing in implementing the framework, the Cali Fund, this new international fund, and an expanded role for indigenous people and local communities. Last element of background information, and then I'll come to COP16 bis in Rome. Funding. Funding is always a very important matter on international negotiation and meetings, UN meetings. You spend a fair amount of your time discussing money. This is no exception. So under the CBD, the convention, you have various financial mechanisms that are trying to gather and then spend money to promote conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. So the first one is the financial mechanism of the convention. It is the Global Environment Facility, the GEF, you may have heard of, which is both a significant mechanism. It is funding not just the CBD, but in fact, 4 other conventions: climate change, desertification, organic pollutants, and also funding in other areas. But the GEF is the financial mechanism of the convention. And 2 years ago, the GEF created a specific sub-fund devoted to the framework, to funding activities in relation to the framework. And now, a few months ago, they've adopted the Cali Fund. Cali Fund is a specialized fund which is devoted to benefit sharing from the use and exploitation of genetic material. Essentially, the story, if you want, goes, you have a pharmaceutical company going into the Amazon, finding genetic material that they find interesting. They bring it home, they make a new medication with it, and they earn billions of dollars. And the host country from the Amazon would say, hey, where's my share of this money? Not as simple as that, but this is the kind of scenarios that make people say, hey, when you benefit from genetic resources, genetic material found on my territory, you should share some of that benefit with the local communities and the domestic groups. The you should share, the you in this case is the private sector, the industry. If they make benefits out of this, they should share those benefits, and they should share it through the Cali Fund. That's a very short way of telling it. And of course, many things have yet to be agreed and determined on the how and how much this sharing should take place. But this is the role of this new fund. So I've mentioned 3 funds: the GEF Fund, the Global Biodiversity Sub-Fund, the Cali Fund. Of course, there are many other avenues for funding: regional banks, bilateral funding, private sector sharing of benefits, There's the Kunming Fund that was created by China with $300 million. And of course, a challenge is to coordinate those things. So here we are. We are at COP16 bis. In a couple of weeks, people will have a 3-day meeting to finalize the work that could not be finalized in Cali. 7 draft decisions have yet to be adopted. So what happened, during those COPs, you have meetings and then sub-meetings and then subgroups, and then on the margins of the subgroups, there are informal discussions and informal discussions. And we even have triple informals, as we call them. And then you go back to double informal, informals, subsidiary bodies, and then go back to plenary with a draft decision saying, please adopt this, and then you would have an agreed decision. What happened in Cali is when the decisions went back to plenary, there was no time and no quorum to adopt them. But you still had those draft decisions almost ready, on the cusp of being ready for formal adoption. The meeting then in Rome will primarily be in plenary sessions. The expectation is that it will not be like a usual COP. There will not be side events. There will not be a huge involvement from observers and the NGO community. The meeting will be primarily states in plenary mode, trying to agree and close those remaining decisions. So I've mentioned 7 decisions. What are they? One is about the financial the resource mobilization strategy. How to attract more money and how to spend your money well, essentially. In that decision, there are draft paragraphs that address a new fund, the creation of a 4th fund that would be dedicated to the convention. The intent behind this, by those who are promoting the adoption of this fund, is to do better than what the GEF is doing presently. There is a fair level of, there's a lack of satisfaction with the GEF. It is perceived as too close to the World Bank, too close to donor countries, too complicated, too complex, not very friendly for recipient countries. So the plan would not be to terminate the GEF involvement, but to have this new separate fund that would be more friendly to recipient countries. And that is essentially the main point that will be up for discussion in Rome, from what we hear or what expectations are. You never know with these things. But even though you have 7 decisions to be adopted, that decision, and specifically the paragraphs of that decision that are talking about a new dedicated fund, is expected to take most of the time of the meeting time in Cali. So that's decision number 1, resource mobilization strategy. Decision number 2 is a decision on the GEF. Essentially saying we're receiving a report from the GEF saying, thank you, you've done good things, you've done other things that you could improve. And by the way, the GEF is soon to discuss a replenishment phase. So how much money should countries put in the GEF for GEF activities? And the convention is giving guidance to the GEF as to what would be the need for the next replenishment of the GEF in relation to the Convention on Biodiversity. So this is decision number 2. 2 other decisions are related to the monitoring of the implementation of the framework. So we have a framework with its targets, with its goals. We have a commitment by each and every party to develop national plans for implementing the framework. And then the question is, okay, how do we know if we are doing well with the implementation of the plan? If parties are doing what they should be doing for implementing the framework at the national level. So you have two decisions and related to that, one on monitoring and one on what we call PMRR. So it's planning, monitoring, reporting, and review. So the whole series of things that should be done. Each party should see how what they're doing at home, reporting to the conference of the party on what they're doing at home. Then the conference of the party is looking at the whole set of reports and saying, okay, how are we doing and how can we be better at implementing the framework? And then you have a couple of other decisions that are secondary and not expected to take much attention. Reports from the two protocols. There are two protocols under the convention. They have to report at every COP. The relationship with other international organizations, the program of work for the next few COPs. So these are obviously interesting and very relevant matters, but not expected to raise much discussion in Rome. They were essentially ready for adoption in Cali. They would have been adopted probably without much discussion if it hadn't been for the loss of quorum. That's about it. I'm sorry, I'm throwing stuff at you. Hopefully enough stuff to prompt questions. I hope I was clear enough. I hope I was not throwing too much at you at once. Let me know, and hopefully questions will come that will tell me that I was at least somewhat intelligible.
Mark, can you share my screen? Or, I mean, can you let everyone look at me? Um, I,
I'm working on it.
it's okay.
It's misbehaving,
It's fine. Um,
but
I
I'll get it in just a moment.
I have a question, Elaine, about just to get us started. I can see that a couple other people already have questions too. But I have a question about metrics of biodiversity. I feel like if people are gonna, or if countries, shareholders are going to be held accountable to their, stated commitments, that there needs to be some kind of metric. And I'm wondering, are there a whole bunch of different ways that those are being measured, and are those being standardized? Is that kind of geeky to ask? Oh, you're on mute. Let's see. There it is. Okay.
All right. Good question. Out of my field, say scientific and technical question, very relevant. There are scientific bodies that are subgroups of the Conference of the Parties, and there is a network of scientists and experts that are addressing a whole lot of different specific areas. And yes, they are developing various ways to measure progress. I couldn't go very far into the specifics of those, but that's part of the work being promoted and pursued under the convention to develop the knowledge and build a network of expert scientists. I'm sorry, I won't be able to elaborate much. This is a lawyer.
Okay. That's funny. I actually do habitat restoration here in my city as like a hobby. I've been doing it for like 15 years. Um, so that's where my mind is. But okay. We have a few questions that weren't written by me. The first one by Paul Flansburgh. Can COP16 benefits outweigh the cessation of leasing for carbon fuel lands by the Biden administration? If there was never a COP, but bad planned environmental degradation ceased, would we be better off?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question. Can you
I don't understand it either. Um, I think
Paul, maybe
that
if you want to.
so I think the question has to do with like, let's say there wasn't a COP, imagining there was no COP at all, but environmental degradation stopped, would nature recover? Like, or does it still need our help?
Well, if bad degradation ceased, yes, hopefully we could call an end to COPs and environmental meetings. I'm not sure we're about to accomplish that. If it is a question about the carbon footprint of traveling to a COP, yes, there is a print, and that COP in Cali was had much higher number of people attending. At the same time, and we've seen it with COVID, meeting on the Zoom and at distance is not sufficient for those meetings. If you want to have negotiations taking place and leading to multilateral global agreements, you need to see people face to face. So I don't know if that address, and I won't comment on any of the administration down there because I might as a Canadian.
Okay, there's a question from Leon Zambikis, and we're gonna have to ask you to unmute, Leon, in order to ask your question.
Yeah, Alain, I'm
Hi.
from Australia, and we've had two Greens comrades, or quite a few actually, attend COP meetings in Denmark and in Paris in the past. And they've been my branch comrades, and they've come back from those conferences, and personally themselves, they don't do much environmental restoration or try getting rid of invasive species. So can the COP or the UN improve its work by actually sending out teams or training people on how to actually do practical things? Because it's all well to write things on paper, but there are really too few people with any real comprehension of how you get rid of invasive species. Example, my comrades here argued to keep the invasive species in the rivers because they're a food source. And two, they've agreed on carbon credit schemes for zero emissions when I've argued to them they are rubbish schemes. So there's a big gap between even nice written documents to real practical work.
I agree. It is a challenge, and with how to get from the niceties at the global level with language like as appropriate and to the extent you feel like it, from there to actual practical measures being taken on the ground. One part of the response is financing and the GEF and those other funds that are supposed to be there with hundreds of millions of dollars, and now we're talking objectives of 20 and 200 billion dollars a year to finance biodiversity. But how do you turn that into funding projects, not meetings, but projects at the national level where it is needed? It is a constant challenge. And part of the criticism directed at the GEF is that they made it too complicated, and it does not result enough into actual practical projects that will make the situation better. So it's a constant challenge. It's a real question. There's those amount of money that I've just mentioned were decided in the framework. So it's the objective of $200 billion a year from all sources and a $20 billion a year from developed to developing countries. Those are the objectives contained in the framework. So one, will we be able to reach them? And two, will we be able to put that money to good and effective use? Are two huge challenges. When I'm mentioning practical projects, it is at the national level. So when parties report on their implementation at the national level, that includes funding, and that includes how do you put projects together, and at the international level through international cooperation. So hopefully This is a long-winded way of saying I agree. It is a very valid question, and it is a challenge. It is a challenge in all areas. But when you talk about an issue that involves essentially the whole world, yes, it is complicated.
Thank you, Elaine. David Schwartzman is next, and I'll have to ask you to unmute. David?
Yes, I did. And thank you so much for such a thorough overview of the process of the Biodiversity Treaty. Really appreciate that. I happen to be a climate scientist, and I'm particularly, well, I want to make a point that preserving biodiversity is really strongly contingent on the success of the other COP process, because unless we limit overshoot of the 1.5 degree centigrade warming target, biodiversity will be severely degraded and progressively degraded. So the two, I would think the two are very closely related. And one is biodiversity is contingent on the limiting well, I would say, phasing out fossil fuels as soon as possible. And that's a political challenge because we see in the world today fossil capital and its political instruments, like in the United States, are going backwards. So it's more of a comment, but I'd like to get your take on the relation of the two COP processes. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm just going to jump in here quickly. We do have a second speaker, and we had told him he could speak at 8:30, so we could wrap up this first part would be helpful.
Okay, I'll respond to David, and then Rachel, I'll let you do what you have to do. Thank you, David. Absolutely, relationship between biodiversity and climate change amply recognized. But then the question is, so what can we do about it, and what should we do about it, including at the COPs? So both COPs, the CBD COPs and the climate change Paris Agreement COPs, have have talks about the relationship between the two. They produce reports, but what about the next step to actually do something about it? There is a process that is about to be put together for the three Rio convention, the three conventions adopted at the Rio conference in '92, climate change, biodiversity, and desertification. And the secretariats of those three conventions are trying to put a process. They were tasked with putting together a process for moving forward on the interlinkages between these three. So very much on people's mind, and then the proof will be in the eating of the pudding, of course, and we'll have to see if they make something good out of it. But it's very, very, very important, as you mentioned.
Thank you so much, Elaine, for meeting with us. You can feel free to stay on if you want to. I know that you're an early bird, so there's no pressure.
Thank you.
Okay. Our next speaker is Spencer Fenniman. He's the manager of the biodynamic Hawthorne Valley Farms.
Rachel,
Yes.
we need to ask Spencer to turn on his video.
Okay.
And also to unmute.
Okay.
You can
I think I did. Can you not see me?
We'll work on it. Go ahead, Rachel.
Okay. He lives in Columbia County, New York. Spencer will address how farmland can enhance biodiversity and how climate policy needs to shift away from exclusively carbon focus and more toward a habitat or whole ecosystem focus. For Spencer, biodynamic farming is a way of life based on connection, managing the soil, the livestock, and the ecology in a holistic manner. Biodynamic agriculture views the farm as a living organism, responsible for maintaining its health and vitality from the living dynamics of the farm instead of being imported. Keenly focused on building soil fertility, low tillage or no tillage is encouraged. Integrated livestock, building compost, and utilizing cover crops generate on-farm fertility and return nitrogen to the soil. Holistically managed cattle grazing develops perennial grassland. Farmers must devote at least 10% of total acreage to wildlife. For example, forests, waterways, and meadows. Disease and insect control is created through botanical species diversity and predator habitat. This aids in carbon drawdown. Welcome, Spencer. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, our farm is located in the foothills of the Taconic Mountains in the Hudson Valley of New York State. And we farm just under 1,000 acres of a very kind of marginal rolling hill ground. We are a diversified farm, so we have both vegetable production and about a 65 cow dairy herd. We value out our products and sell mostly in the New York City area, as well as on our own farm on retail. And so the farm's been under organic and biodynamic management for 50 years. And for the past 20 years, we've been working with a team of ecologists on our farm. And the goal there was kind of born out of a vision of what habitats can be produced by farmland. And what can we do on our farms to kind of re-engage certain emergent properties that exist in nature outside of highly managed productive farmland? And how can we enhance the edge effect across all of our fields? How can we take a riparian corridor and build a link to a bunch of different habitats throughout our farm? And I guess the last question would be, how can we utilize livestock as a management tool to promote some of these habitats? So instead of just going out and mowing, how can the interaction of cows in a landscape create a new sort of interaction that might support species beyond just the ones that we're farming? That was the question, and over 20 years has been the work. And I'm on the farming end, so I can't quite speak to the ecology, but what it does look like on a practical level is that certain habitats have really expanded over the years. We did a survey 4 years ago of the farm, and we surveyed about 400 of the acres. We don't own much of it, and we have a lot of non-contiguous land. But we found 14 distinct habitats. And of those 14 habitats, there was really a wide range of diversity that was happening. And some of that agricultural land, generally speaking, is going to be on the low end of the diversity scale. And the non-agricultural land is a little bit more on the higher diversity scale. For instance, the floodplain forest that runs right along our farm, we have a larger creek, represented about 12 acres. And in those 12 acres was 233 different plant species. 77% of them were native. Pasture, which is our predominant land use, making up about 33%. We're a grass-based dairy, representing 167 acres. In the survey, had 161 plant species. So with 52% of them being native. So right there, you can see that as far as a hotspot goes, the floodplain forest had a dramatically larger effect towards harboring native species. And what are those species doing for the farm? Is another question that can be a little bit hard to directly answer, because we really enter into the realm more of interaction and less on a focus on what individuals do. So when we're growing a crop of squash, for instance, is that squash benefiting from the presence of a wide diversity of different insect, birds, mammals? Usually not mammals, but is that interaction actually producing a better crop, or are we actually utilizing that crop to produce a better outcome for nature? It's a difficult question to pin down. I think some of the benefits stating that you have these potentials for increased yields because of pollinators might not always be quite accurate. It's in learning from the ecologist, it's a difficult to actually pin down kind of causal relationships. But I know in the last, I came in a little bit late, and there was a question around, what is lost from some ecological repair. Well, how do we lose? How does nature come back? And so the Northeast is an interesting example because there was massive land clearance that happened after colonization. And there's very little surviving ancient forest. And the ancient forest is land that was not actually cleared during that. And there are certain tree species that will not return, despite the fact that we have one of the fastest growing forests in the world right now in the Northeast. But there are certain species, I think it's yellow birch is a tree species that will not come back. And with one of those key species is going to host a whole elaborate interaction of other dependent species upon that. There's a mycological network that's not coming back. Certain plant species, flowering plants are not coming back. And with those, some of the insects that establish relationships. And that's not to say that nothing will come back. And I think it's really impressive that giving space to nature on the edge of a field, kind of what emerges without actually doing anything. I think it's a strong, difficult cultural shift for farmers to operate out of a mindset of letting areas go. I think there's a very strong cultural embeddedness in keeping a farm tidy, keeping a landscape tidy. A lot of landowners we work with want to see farmland that looks closer to a lawn. But in that emergence, and sometimes, I hate to say it, sometimes it's going to be an invasive species might provide the best conditions for a certain bird species to flourish. Someone mentions multiflora rose in this chat. Multiflora rose can have a really wonderful ground cover, especially on the edge of a field, which can both provide perching spaces for birds as well as safety spot at the base. Granted, invasive species do tend to crowd out native plants, but there is a point at which some invasive species are going to play a role in a transitional landscape. I think three small anecdotes about some successes that we've had and failures might help illuminate the situation. For one, we've identified wetlands for spotted turtle habitat, which has been an interesting process over the last couple of years. We've been able to get some funding to do some radio tracking of spotted turtles and see how they interact with farmland adjacent. And turns out they mostly keep to the wetland, but by fencing off the wetland from cattle, we've been able to preserve that spotted turtle habitat. These are animals that have very long lifespans, are relatively rare in our county. We got a grant from the NRCS, which is the Natural Resource Conservation Service, to install a couple of beetle banks in our fields. And these are installations where you plant native species, mostly grasses, but some flowering species, in a way to enhance the potential habitat for ground beetles. And ground beetles, there's a host of them. They are typically underappreciated, and they serve a lot of functions in soil ecosystems. What follow-up analysis over the last 8 years or so since we installed these ground beetle banks was that the ground beetles were not actually using them, and that there were higher populations of ground beetles in the edges of the field. In one spot had the highest diversity of ground beetles in spring emergence traps was a pile of rocks that the farmers have been piling on the side. And those kind of point towards this idea that there isn't necessarily a blueprint on how we can be effective, that sometimes we have all the spaces that we need, we just need to manage them slightly different. And mostly disregard the mower at some times, let spaces go a little bit wilder. And the cost and effort in establishing some of these installations is often not actually reaching, there isn't actually the return for nature there. Now, we did have increased bloom, so we did have increased pollinator activity, but those could have existed on the margin of the field and not within the field itself. We are still trying to grow food and be a productive and profitable farm. And then the grassland birds is an interesting picture as well. Following large land clearing, a lot of Midwestern grassland bird species moved in to the Northeast. So eastern meadowlarks and bobolinks and savanna sparrow populations really expanded with the advent of more meadows, more sheep grazing. And what's happened, bobolinks are, I believe, at least in our part of the world, are one of the smallest long migrations. These are birds that fly from south central Argentina up to breed in the Northeast. And formerly the Midwest, but the species has been collapsing in the Midwest due to conversion to row crop farming. So corn and soy is basically destroying the habitat of grassland that once favored the bobolink. These are birds that build their nests in the ground, right along the ground, and need relatively undisturbed nesting spots until mid-July. And up until right around probably the 1970s and 80s, haymaking was typically done around that time period, which haymaking, where you harvest the hay from the field to feed for the animals over the winter, was done at a period when the birds had already been able to fledge their young. So it was, they were coming, they were breeding, and they were able to fledge their young. With more and more corn and soy production and plowing, the birds had less and less habitat. and earlier hay cutting with the form of silage has further decreased that habitat. We have been working to manage, and the key thing here is that in farming still has to be productive. Margins are shrinking. There needs to be some profitability at the end of the day. So you can't necessarily manage for everything everywhere. So within our farmland, we're going to identify certain areas to maintain some of that bird habitat, while others we're going to harvest earlier and sacrifice any potential for bird habitat there. And so about 30 to 40% of our hay fields are cut later. We allow for the birds to fledge, and we've seen relatively stable bobolink numbers despite a pretty dramatic species decline. That being said, this is a bird that has a global presence. It is flying
This is
every
Rachel.
year from
Hear
Argentina
me?
to the Northeast.
Hi, Spencer.
Oh, yeah.
Just wrap it up about now, and then we can let some people ask you questions.
Okay, sure.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
so I mean, I guess the last things I'd want to say is that you know, that funding is really important. Altruism is can only go so far, and that there needs to be some mechanism to make some of these opportunities become more of a reality on farms. Farmland's 45% of the United States land use and is the biggest untapped potential for biodiversity management, I think.
There's been some discussions in the chat, but I'm not sure that any of them are actually. Oh, here's one about cattle. Do cattle need a certain type of grass, or can you graze cattle on native grasses?
There are some people doing native. Most native grasses in the Northeast are lower quality. At this point, Eurasian grasses are naturalized for the most part. So while there is some small forays into using native pasture, for the most part, our basis is a Eurasian grass, which again, that Eurasian grass is actually working pretty well with the grassland bird habitat, for instance.
Okay, I have a question. How do you do all this biodiversity work and still run a profit?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we're a highly diversified farm that's part of a nonprofit. So one key element is the nonprofit. The other key element is diversification and expanding into direct marketing. Direct marketing and value added is what has kept our small dairy going. Selling yogurt as opposed to milk is a very different proposition. But the nonprofit, I can't, understate enough the fact that a nonprofit is really what has allowed us to do more of this than most farms might.
Sorry, apparently somebody had their hand raised and I don't see it. Maureen. Oops, I muted you on accident. Now I'm asking you to unmute. Sorry.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Thanks, Rachel.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Spencer, this is a fascinating thing to me because I'm a farmer. I love biodynamics and Rudolf Steiner and all that stuff. But my question is, with climate change, I don't know if you're familiar with the book Walden Warming, and it's not really important if you are or not. But that book just talks about the different bird species migrating at different times and how that affects like them being able to take advantage of berries and you mentioned like haying and so that they could nest during the hay, do you notice like a difference with climate change? I'm not really sure where you are actually.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there have been there's the ecologists that we work with have a lot of interest in looking back at historical record and the timing of some of these arrivals, as well as the pollination time of certain insects. And we have seen insects who have become untethered with their host plants, which is where host flowers are blooming earlier than the insects are actually coming out. And so climate change is extremely disrupting, not to mention making it extremely difficult to keep farming. So.
Okay, and Leon has a question and he's unmuted now.
Thanks, Spencer. Interesting farm stuff. I know some farmers around here getting permission to shoot on their properties for native animal, invasive animals, deer and rabbits. My question is, during the election, were you able to convince any of your fellow farmers to sort of steer their vote towards the Greens, if you had any Greens people running in your area to be elected? Can you describe if any of that occurred?
I would say the farming community on a whole skews pretty conservative. I think there's a general tendency towards the desire for deregulation in the American, at least in our local farming community. Though, in reading anecdotal news stories, a lot of the climate funding that came out of the government in the last administration was really readily adopted by farmers. With tight margins, I think being paid, the idea of ecosystem services and payment for ecosystem services can become pretty appealing, especially towards farms that aren't creating massive externalities. I see a comment about CAFOs, and the notion of CAFOs are a better land use is really problematic, just due to the massive waste stream that those CAFOs are creating. So I would say that while there are, I'm sure, sympathetic farmers to the Green Party, I'm not sure that's a easy sell in the larger farming community. But who knows?
That's the game we're in.
Thank you, Spencer. Thanks to everybody who had questions. Thanks everyone for coming. I wanted to share some books that I have, just so people know that if you're interested in getting into either habitat, creating habitat in your communities. First of all, Spencer, I just got this book, The Green New Deal from Below. It just arrived today, and I attended a webinar with this author and heard him talking. And you're actually enacting the things that he's touting in this book, that we can't rely necessarily, and the COP is really important, right? But we can't necessarily rely on people who are far away making big decisions for all of us, right? We can actually start making changes, just like you're doing, Spencer, in our own communities and bolstering biodiversity locally, right? And it's going to take all of us in order to do that. I have this other book from the Xerces Society. The Xerces Society is an organization that disseminates information and promotes biodiversity for insects. So I've read some other things that from the Xerces Society about fireflies, and I was able to influence my local city council because I was advocating for a small prairie installation by explaining the mating habits of fireflies, and that worked. But you can farm, you can actually reduce your need for pesticides by actually creating habitat for these beneficial insects that actually eat the things that eat your plants. Let's see, I have this other one, the urban farmer. So even if you're in a city, you can, you can create habitat in your backyard. You can ask your neighbors if you can use their backyards or their front yards, and you can actually become an urban farmer and increase biodiversity that way, and be profitable. Just like what Spencer said, by doing direct to consumer marketing and by value added items, and being kind of creative and coming up with new products that you can increase your value on those things. If you're just somebody who has a house, here's a book about butterfly gardening, and you just want to like help out. Every little bit of habitat is going to make a difference. This book, Bringing Nature Home, it's all about the different kind of trees and what kinds of insects live on those trees. And you can develop a relationship with your local habitat by reading a book like this and finding out. The oak tree actually has over 400 different kinds of caterpillars that live on it and need them, and so having just an oak tree, just one oak tree, can make a huge difference in bolstering biodiversity in your backyard. Okay, so I'm gonna stop with my little thing. I'm so glad I was able to say all that, though. Thank you for bearing with me. The EcoAction Committee is considering a suggestion. We're going to write up some verbiage that we're going to be encouraging the state parties to do. So I think it's going to be a call to action. And I just wanted to let everyone know that we're going to be working on that. And for those of you in the audience who are actually members of EcoAction, we will be having our membership meeting next Monday again. And I think, is that everything? Am I missing anything? Maureen, David, Mark?
Let me work on this. I will just mention today that we, the National Green Party, put out a press release that really went after, who's that guy, Trump, who honestly has been very devastating towards climate. And it's really incumbent that we get our state leaders, governors, or city councils, town boards, to pick up the slack. And one of the things we pointed out, unfortunately, here in New York, which is considered, the big Democratic state, our governor has been retreating so quickly on climate, very heavily promoting nuclear power, backing off on carbon pricing. Just Friday, she really violated our new state climate law, which everybody, claims so much credit for, but, she approved a major expansion of the Iroquois gas pipeline, which ships gas from the Canadian border down into New York City. So we're just in a very dire moment, and, EcoAction, the Green Party, is trying to figure out, how do we contribute to the fight, pushing back against what Trump is doing, recognizing, of course, that Biden and the Democrats were a major, major disappointment on so many climate issues.
Could I chip in very quickly? I want to say how much I appreciate this webinar. Thank you so much for the work that you've done. It's really terrific and great exchanges and so on. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, David. David's our new co-chair. Glad to have you on, Dave. Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming. I hope that this was informative. I hope you can come to see more webinars of ours. What's the next one? Is it going to be on